I think it would take me longer to drive from here to Atlanta, Georgia, than it would be for people to drive from like Moscow to Kiev. Now, of course, there's like resistance and all that kind of shit, but we are talking about Russia, one of the most fearsome historical militaries in the world. And yet we're seeing them being held off by Ukrainian dickheads with tractors and modern Western weapons. But your language kind of betrays exactly my fucking problem. Is like, okay, so real-time strategy or whatever the fuck. I think you're right. Forgive me for remembering a little bit of history. But wasn't it like the fucking Serbs who wanted to maintain everybody within their sphere of influence? And when the Croats and the fucking Muslims broke off, they just started slaughtering the shit out of everybody. So all the people in your fucking chat who are pussy aching about NATO fucking bombing shit, no offense, you Serb cunts, but you fucking started it. Okay, so just to be clear, what you just said is 2,500 Nazi militia members out of a 300,000 strong army, led by a Jewish fucking president, was an existential threat to Russia. I just want to be clear that that's what you just said.
But basically, to be respectful, I would say I want a parking space project for the territory that currently is North America.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pedro, and I am the co-owner of The Crucible, and this is tonight's main event. Two friends of The Crucible will be going head-to-head on the topic of Ukraine versus Russia, thing that's been going across almost anybody who has access to the internet's mind right now. Our friend, first and foremost, well, not first and foremost, not like we don't like the other, JF Gary Epi will be going head-to-head with Counterpoints. Each debater will be given 7-minute opening statements, an hour to hour 30 of cross-examination for each other. It's a free-flow conversation, and then a 7-minute closing statement. After which, both debaters will be questioned by myself, and then we will go to audience questions. Please enjoy. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And as promised, we have first up JF Gary Epi. Welcome back, JF. Oh, go for it.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice. How you been?
I've been great.
Awesome. Have you had any people from your side take a plane and join up with the Ukraine army?
Oh no, absolutely not. I would not be their friends.
Okay. Oh, yep. Like we said, ladies and gentlemen, he will be taking the pro-Russia side against our other friend of the channel, Counterpoints. Say what's up, Counterpoints.
What's up, y'all? How you doing?
Good, man. So we've already taken the time in the background to discuss who's going to open first, and that is going to be JF Gary Epi. But before that, can you both, we'll start with JF, just give a shout out to your channel where people can find you, you know?
Absolutely. I'm on Odyssey. Find JFG Tonight on Odyssey. I'm there every night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. JFG Tonight.
Perfect. And then Counterpoints, can you tell them where they can find you?
Yeah, so I'm still on YouTube and Twitch. We'll see for how long, and then we'll be going to Odyssey shortly. And then basically, all you have to do is type in Counterpoints, common spelling. You should be able to find me, and also on Twitter _Counterpoints _, and you can find me there as well. And all my socials will be linked. So yeah.
Awesome. Hey, I want to thank you both for coming here to have this discussion. I'm very excited to hear what you guys' takes on the matter is. After the Destiny versus Fuentes debate, I'm kind of leaning towards a certain spot that I won't publicly reveal yet, but I want to see where you guys can take me. But for right now, JF, go open with your
All
statement.
right. So today on my TV, I often carry an American flag and a Quebec flag because those are two nations that I respect. But today I chose to put some illustrations on the TV behind me of the greatness of the Russian people and some of the great things they've accomplished. Although I'm not a Sovietic, I'm not a communist. For example, I've included the Soviet flag, and here you can see Catherine the Great, who was a Tsar, who conquered Crimea, and you'll also see an image of Alexander II, a Tsar who was the liberator of the slaves in Russia. All this to say, Russia has been a great nation, a nation that has been pursuing its own interest in a line that totally differs from that of the West and that at times constitutes an antagonism for the West. And so for people in the West, there is a big question here on where to stand, and it seems that a lot of the normies have decided to stand with Ukraine. However, I would like to make a different point today for people like me in the West, that we have something to gain in having a strong Russia in this conflict, in having an antagonist to the NATO expansion that has been happening in the West and elsewhere as it expands further and further east. And that, in fact, if you are like me and you dislike the direction that the Western world has taken, you dislike what is being done in our school in terms of LGBT propaganda, you dislike what is happening with the military empire that the Americans are installing, that it's all good what's happening right now. It's all good that something else is showing up. So that will be from the perspective of the West. I will also defend that from the perspective of Russia itself. Russia has all of the justifications needed to justify this war. It is well-founded. It is well-founded more than any war that America has embarked on in the last 60 years. There is not a single military intervention out of the dozens that we've seen from America that bears a better justification than the one that Russia has. And in fact, I will have a third category of argument, which is that it's even good for Ukraine, what's happening. That ultimately Ukraine is a shithole of the world right now, a place of criminality, human trafficking, and neo-Nazism, and that a little bit of denazification of Ukraine wouldn't hurt it. I know that there's human suffering. I don't deny it. It's horrible. There are humans suffering from this war totally unjustly. However, in the long run, a little bit of denazification, a little bit of removal of military power for Ukraine will be better even for the Ukrainians. So let's start with the perspective from the West. The governmental regimes protected by NATO are hypocritical political beasts that present themselves as open and free, when in fact the American totalitarian regime works on the exclusion of free thought by cancel culture, the exclusion of dissidents by financial isolation, and the transformation of the economy into exclusive cartels for the ruling class to benefit from. This regime has been constantly expanding in its anti-white actions, as well as the anti-reproductive agenda that takes the form of political LGBT activism in our schools and forced sex surgery onto children. It is time for this regime to be countered by a force, and Russia is not a perfect force. I wouldn't want to live in Russia. I'm a libertarian. I would probably end up in jail very quick in Russia. I'm too much of a contrarian. However, we should celebrate the fact that some force is showing up. Some force is showing up and showing a different way to live to Americans. So I celebrate that at least. 2. From the perspective of Russia itself. The current regime of Ukraine is an anti-Russian genocidal regime installed through an armed revolutionary coup which denied the legitimacy of the Ukrainian democracy. The Ukrainian regime has been pursuing anti-Russian policies aimed at making life miserable to dissidents of the Zelensky and Poroshenko regimes, which included exclusion from public employment for more than 1 million Ukrainians who were judged too sympathetic to Russia to have a job in the government, exclusion from public pensions and bank services for people in the Donbass region for ideological dissidents, loss of employment opportunity for people judged to have dissident political opinions, violent oppression of ethnic Russians in the Donbass region by the Azov Battalion, a neo-Nazi group. More than 13,000 people have died, and that's a count from the United Nations. More than 13,000 people have died in the last decade in the war against the Donbass region. And on top of it, there was a denial of democratic process for the votes that occurred in Crimea, the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic, who all voted to confirm their desire to either join Russia or become independent republics of their own. But instead of respecting that vote, what Ukraine did is treat them like terrorists, say this vote is invalid, it's been done in circumstances that we don't acknowledge, and so as a result, you have a denial of the right of people to self-determine. But most importantly for Russia, the Ukrainian regime has broken the promises that it has signed, that it would commit to toward Russia. First, the Zelensky regime got elected with the promise of ending the war on Donbass. He didn't end it at all. So he campaigned on the subject of, we're going to end the war on Donbass. It's going to be over. We're going to stop shelling them. But he continued. The shelling continued and the domination of territories by the Ukrainian army expanded since then. And most importantly, the breach of the Minsk agreements. So there were a series of 2 agreements since 2014 in which the Ukrainian regime has committed to respect the independence of the regions of the DPR and LPR, respect their election, and also respect, by adding constitutional changes, respect the sovereignty of the various sections of Ukraine. They didn't respect it, they didn't do the constitutional changes, and so Russia has to come in to defend a population that is targeted by ethnic hate.
All right, thank you, sir. And Counterpoints, you want to give us your opening statement?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there, I think they would say. So so basically I do agree with JF on one thing, which is this is the battle. I'll use a derogatory term. This is the battle between isolationist nations that want to carve their own future and seek their own geopolitical interest versus what is colloquially known as, good God, colloquially known as globo homo. Okay. So it's the internationalist, globalist, Western hegemony, and whether or not that's a good thing. That's what we're really talking about here. So there were even questions within the past like 20 to 30 years whether or not Russia would be integrated into this like internationalist, globalist hegemony. But then that boiled down to not personal conflicts, but national level conflicts, that there were irreconcilable differences for Russia to be integrated. And as a result, it remained a independent but pushed to the side power in Europe. So it's always had this history, and I think it's unfortunate because I think it could have been integrated. So the question kind of boils down to, if we're just going to do like realpolitik, geopolitical interest, then all of your arguments can be reversed on their own head for appeals to hypocrisy. If you want to get into nitty gritty, if you want to bring up specific things, then I'm perfectly fine with that, and I can follow you down the logic chain of all those things. But at the same time, the reason why there were ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine is because of original Russian expansionism during the USSR period. The reason why there's Russians in Crimea is because of a Russian military base. The reason why these conflicts have occurred is because there was already a stoking of the flame for separatism separate from Ukraine, because Ukraine was drifting into the gravity well of Europe, the EU, NATO, and and America, if you want to use that as a proxy. So that becomes a question of what is the role. Like we have three separate interests: the United States and the Western hegemony, Ukraine as an independent nation, and Russia as its own isolationist but independent state. These things are completely at odds. And all of the things that you complained about when it came to Ukrainian sovereignty and its corruption and how it's fucked over its people and all that kind of stuff, a majority of that could be solved with 21st century approaches to problems, which involve like diplomacy, economic integration, cultural integration, civic nationalism, and I'm trying to think of a whole host of other words that people who are making Russian apologia abhor. And so it's really weird to see like, oh no, we need to double down and triple down on the things that created this situation in the first place. If you want to blame NATO, if you want to blame Russia, as a matter of fact, I just want to get into the fucking open, because basically what's going on is you can blame any individual party, you can cite any individual historic event, but the question is a globalized, economically integrated society good? Or should we, as JF is saying, valorize the people who are trying to break away from this Western hegemon? And I'm ready to open it up on that subject.
Awesome, gentlemen. The floor is open.
All right. Well, it's interesting because this whole idea that Russians essentially have been sent into Ukraine and that this creates an unnatural state of things is completely contrary to the very globalized system that is pushed on the side of Ukraine. See, because if we have democratic societies, open societies that are willing to welcome different voices, then it shouldn't be a problem. Why is it suddenly a problem for the left that there's Russian immigration into Ukraine? It seems that if Ukraine was the bearer of open values that the globalists want it to be, it seems that it wouldn't be a problem, and that we should have a voice as Russians inside Ukraine, that they should have a voice, and that it wouldn't matter if they vote, for example, for Yanuchenko. But the problem with the way Ukraine has dealt with this force, which is distinct from the globalist force that wants Ukraine to become something else, is that they've oppressed them. Is that instead of saying, okay, your voice in democracy will count just like the voice of anyone, instead they went after them, they deprived them of public employment, and in fact, when they successfully elected one of their own, Yanukovych, in 2010, they eventually ousted this president, which was very much pro-Russian, or more pro-Russian, say, than the alternatives. And they ousted him. They ousted him with a coup of armed revolutionaries, which included snipers in buildings downtown shooting onto civilians. Let's not forget what Ukraine of today is. It is the result of this coup. Now, it seems that Counterpoint is suggesting that the presence of ethnic Russians in Ukraine is illegitimate. Is that what you're saying? Can you say it openly?
No.
No.
And this is the thing though. So I want to avoid like the individual historic tit for tat, because basically all of the historic narrative that you've just cited is contested. So, that the Maiden Revolution, was it peaceful or was it not peaceful? There were cops who got shot too. There were protesters who got shot. Who were the snipers? This, that, the other. The overall narrative, though, that I think both you and I can agree to is that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's been an open question what happens with NATO and the Eastern Bloc and Russia, and how are they integrated or not integrated into Europe? And that's a question that we've been answering over the past 30 or 40 years with NATO and Western hegemons increasingly trying to get previous Warsaw Pact countries into NATO and integrate economic interests because it's a part of the sprawling cosmopolitan internationalist project. I think you and I both agree on that. And then I don't want to quibble over like the individual like historical events, because you and I are going to fight about, is it a peaceful protest or is it a violent revolution? Okay. But what I want
Well, I
to
don't know
answer your
that you can
question.
call peaceful protest. I don't know that there's
Mm,
any case that can be made for a peaceful protest when it results in the ousting from the country of the
mhm.
legitimate president of that country, and when there's snipers shooting onto people. It's definitely not peaceful.
Right, but the snipers were shooting the protesters and the cops simultaneously. So like there were casualties on both sides. So I just as easily, if I wanted to get into the nitty-gritty with you, I could say, "Oh, well, you started it." You know, the Russians started it. They had planted snipers who were shooting protesters, so the protesters would get angry, so they would oust, so they would back off, and then that instead of backing off, they decided to oust the president. Like we could go down this nitty gritty like hypothesizing, or we could go with the broad strokes, which is Russia has a contradictory interest. The United States and NATO and the EU, like I'm looking for a term that just summarizes all of it. If you want to say Western hegemony
Sure.
has an opposed interest. And so what it boils down to is why there are legitimate geopolitical grievances on behalf of Russia. Why couldn't those have been achieved through diplomacy, through negotiation? Because what we're really talking about is we're talking about access to Crimea. We're talking about like geographic and economic access to Ukraine as a trading partner and an energy partner. These things could have all been integrated. And instead of going with a 21st century competitive, negotiative economic model, which seems to be the way that the Western world is going, we went to 20th century style nationalist level conflict. And I think it's been a shock for a lot of people in the Western world, because we're like, what the fuck? Like, we negotiate, we do economic diplomacy, we do national level diplomacy. We don't invade countries and artillery bombard cities. What the fuck is this barbaric ass bullshit? And that's where, for me, it's like, you can say Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea have legitimate grievances for breaking away, and I'm not going to contest any of that. But then why the fuck didn't Russia basically take Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea and then say, we're going to protect these motherfuckers, and Kiev, you can go fuck yourself? Why was it
Very
necessary to invade
interesting.
the rest of, yeah, why was it necessary to invade the rest of the country?
That's the interesting territory in which I want to get. So let's talk about it.
Cool.
Let's not forget that when Vladimir Putin launched this operation, he called it an operation in the Donbass to protect essentially the people of the Donbass. The problem being the Ukrainian army has been stacking force on its territory and has been in fact displaying interest at stacking further force in the form of NATO troops eventually coming in, which was the project before this whole war, which seems to have been now abandoned by Zelensky. But however, this was the context, the historical context in which this special operation was developed. It was the possibility that Ukraine would become a NATO territory. Now, the problem of Ukraine becoming a NATO territory is that it poses an existential risk for Russia. The problem being that Russia would be quite happy with a Ukraine that is kind of neutral and following its own interest and not too much siding with the side of America. However, a Ukraine which is being enslaved by American interest and in corrupt manners, as we've seen with the case of Burisma, the Joe Biden intervention there, Russia cannot have confidence
Can
long
I
term
can I
that
pause you right
Ukraine would
there?
follow rational decision. But go ahead.
Yeah, so the reason why I want to pause you is because you keep using these loaded terms, and by the way, like I'm gonna try to take you as charitably as possible, but these terms like enslavement of the Ukrainian people or the corruption of the Ukrainian government, do you honestly think that these things are going to improve under Russian tutelage? So let's say in this hypothetical world, Russia is able to oust the Zelensky government. They seize all of Ukraine as a proxy state. They install another, regime that is more favorable to Moscow. Do you think that the corruption and nepotism and oligarchical structures that are already inherent in Ukraine are going to get better or worse under Russian tutelage versus Western tutelage? Which one do you think is better?
I believe that given that this corruption stems from America itself, as we've seen in the case of Hunter Biden and Burisma, since America is intervening in a way as to keep the Ukrainian authority from even prosecuting their own cases of corruption, then I believe that any other nation would be best fit to give a tutelage relationship toward Ukraine, although I don't think it's Vladimir Putin's goals necessarily. I
Okay,
don't think that
then
the
with
scenario
that
you
point,
presented is what will happen.
well, with that point though, looking at Russia as an example in which there is this like hybrid of state interest and corporate interest where literally like it's like, oh, this is the CEO of our telecom guy, this is the CEO of our rail guy, this is the CEO of this company, that company, that company, and they literally just like sit on the fucking boards of government where they're basically Putin's pals, and the money literally just flows into the most powerful pockets inside Russia and then vis-a-vis into the government. And it's more like a unified oligarchical like cabal where we don't even have the illusion of separation of power, of corporate interest and political interest. Like, how can you say that this is preferential and less corrupt than having some dickhead fail son of a president be on a board making money that he doesn't deserve? By the way, I completely agree with you that this is corruption and nepotism. I'm just asking if this is the scale. So is having a dickhead fail son on the board of a gas company the same as appointing your dickhead son the leader of the gas company and also having him have a like cabinet position within the government? Because that's the kind of like social organization we're talking about in Russia.
There is a problem in your presentation of the American situation, which is that it's too
Mm,
generous and too naive. The problem is not
mm,
just that Hunter Biden is on a board of a gas corporation or whatever. The
mhm.
problem is that they have shown that they were willing to integrate the power of both the private world in Hunter Biden and the public world in Joe Biden to work together to keep a corruption case from being brought to justice. That is interference with the law. That is making sure
Mhm.
that the law doesn't get applied. And the fact that they could pull this in Ukraine leads me to believe that yes, there are forms of corruption in Russia and it's terrible, but it's not as corrupt as this. I've never seen Russia go into Ukraine and stop a corruption case from happening. I've seen it being done
Do you
by
think you would
American
even hear
elites.
about it if they did?
Would I what?
Would you even hear about it if they did?
Well, there would be American interest who would be sure to put it into CNN, believe me.
I okay. I You call my perspective naive. I think your
But
perspective
but
is
this is
equally
where
naive.
I love the Russia action here, which is that it
Mhm.
creates a mirror to what America truly is. Because
Mhm.
you've described the situation in Russia
Oh
as
no.
being
Did I lose
full
you guys?
oligarchical power. Now that's interesting because everything that you said about Russia can be said of the US. And what you end up ascribing to the US as a difference is that at least an illusion is maintained here. In other words, you're saying the US is as corrupt as Russia, but at least we're cradling ourselves into the fake belief that it is not. Well, I say it is time for this deception to end. It is time for us to realize that America is a corrupt oligarchical regime and that everything that has ever been criticized on the side of Russia actually applies to America, and everything that this guy said tonight applies to America. But I think we lost him, Pedro.
Yes, it seems like I think you may have won the debate, sir. No, I'm kidding. I
The
obviously
Soviet Empire wins again.
Hey, well, what's probably happening? He's going through some technical difficulties, so we'll give him a second to jump back on. Probably reset his setup, his rig, or whatever he's got going on that side. Um, Man, I guess maybe for now I can try and interact. I think that might be
Mhm.
appropriate. So, where I am in the conversation, how I'm understanding it is, it's sort of a Mott and Bailey. You both realize that both systems are corrupted, correct?
Yes.
One system will allow what that is making you say this is a better system? What is the thing that you say, okay, this is why I would go with that more corrupt system or
And
corrupt?
this is where I want him to come back, because I want to get to this subject, which is the choice here is not whether I will want to live in Russia. I don't. So I don't care about how corrupt the Russian system is. The consideration that we have to take seriously is, how big do I want the American empire to be? How big do I want NATO to be? And how ultimately totalitarian and oppressive do I want the American empire to be? And given that the American empire is taken over by corrupt forces that are hurting me much more than the corrupt forces of Russia, which basically don't affect my life at all, I say we want the American empire to be as weak as possible. And so I say, let us side with this war, with Russia's position, because it undermines the power of our own elites.
Yeah, I would very much like to interact with that when it's actually my time to come into the debate at the end. But Counterpoints, are you still there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. So what's
right,
the
I'm
last thing
getting-
you heard, just to make sure that you're up to speed?
No,
I believe that a Russian missile has hit the infrastructure where Counterpoints is.
I think Russia heard me talking shit, and they were like, "We need to get this motherfucker off the air. What is going
These
on?"
hypersonic missiles can go around the planet in no time.
They're like,
Yeah.
nah, we're not having this. We're not having
We're
this.
not having, yeah, exactly. So no. I'm working on my good internet and my good connection. So if my audio sounds like shit, it should get better in a second once I get everything reset.
Yeah,
But no, just to finish the point, like JF, like all due respect, I don't think that the comparing these levels of corruption is fair. I think if you look at the Russian oligarchical system, I mean, if you just look at the history of the Soviet Union and Russia as a whole, pretty much it is a story of corruption and development and failure and nepotism. And so to expect these things to disappear overnight just because Ukraine becomes independent, I think is a little bit silly. And then to pretend that okay, so I'm not denying, by the way, like, I'm not going to deny Hunter Biden being on the board is fucked up. I railed about that for like months. But at the same time, pretending that's equivalent to like having an intentionally oligarchical structure, I think that's incorrect, to put it lightly.
But you're looking at it from the outside. From Russia's perspective, certainly having their own oligarchs in place would be better than having the enemy's oligarch, right?
Sure, but so is this so you kind of went from one point to the other. The United States and the Western world is as corrupt as the Russians are, or at least they're not blameless. And then this is a different point, which is, if you were a self-interested party, wouldn't you be interested in your nepotism rather than your opponent's nepotism? The answer to your question is obviously yes.
Okay. So that brings us to ultimately us as outside observers, because I don't think you're an oligarch and I'm not an oligarch either.
Not
And
yet.
so the ultimate question that I was introducing to Pedro while you were gone is, how big do we want NATO to be? He's gone again. Oh, there he is. All right, he's back. Hello. All
Man,
right,
it
the
had to
audio.
be this way when I came on, huh? Man. Okay. Counterpoints, we can't hear you, sir.
Okay, so I was saying
There
your
we go.
was inaccurate, so they only damaged my internet provider. They didn't completely destroy it.
Okay, well, we'll try to do better next time. So, how big do we want NATO to be? And ultimately, it boils down to this. Do you enjoy the West? Are you siding with the West? Personally, and I think it's going to boil down to an issue of preference here, but personally, I want the West to fall. I want the West to be as weak as possible, because what has been done militarily by the West is disgusting. The recruitment of white men by the government of America for serving the security interest of the state of Israel for for many decades now is nonsensical. It's the use of white men as meat cannon for the interest of a foreign power. What is being done with the leftist takeover of our institutions, academia, media, and public schools is horrible. I want any force to eventually put this down, or at least weaken it, or at least give it a sense that it's not there forever. And so, to me, anything that can weaken the West is good, and this conflict certainly makes the West think twice about its own power and its own capacity to react to these hypersonic dagger missiles. So I guess that on your side, you side with the West. You want a strong NATO and an expansionist NATO and ultimately a strong West.
Yeah, and actually, this is interesting. So we disagree on some descriptors that I wouldn't mind getting into, but also you're right. If we were looking at like a historical parallel, I don't view us as the underdog. I do view us as like a global imperial hegemon. But I think our imperialism is like a little bit different than, let's say, like Rome, where you actually need to control territory, or England, which is purely, I don't want to say purely, but it's territory and economic, where they have to have their little colonies in order to be in charge. Whereas I would say with the Western world, it's a little bit different, where we don't actually have to own the territory. You have to be willing to trade with us, and there have to be people who are in power who are willing to trade with us, and that's kind of the way it is. Also, my what I would be inviting anybody who agrees with you to think about is that a lot of these things that we're talking about, which is like, we fought wars for Israel for the past 30 to 50 years. I don't think we fought wars for Israel for the past 30 to 50 years. I think we fought for aligned interest of a $65 trillion multinational global capitalist cabal. And so you have to answer the question of whether or not that's good or not. My room, I'm part of the quote unquote imperial core from a leftist analysis. My room is filled with the products of this imperium, including plastic and metals and rare earth metals and, technology that allows me to talk with you, even though you're thousands of miles away. This has clearly benefited a lot of people materially. And also, I would say that Ukraine, in its drift towards the West, was seeking these material benefits. Now, there is a real problem. The problem, I think, is spiritual, which is basically that there is no sense of identity. There is no sense of purpose. There is no sense of, basically what is a human being to do when they wake up besides like eat shit, fuck, and gain material possessions. That's a hollow existence. But the question is whether or not that's preferable to the alternative, which at this point, I'm hoping sober people who are actually watching war footage are like, oh shit, my life actually could be a lot worse. I could run out of power. I could run out of food. Things could go sideways. I could be killing my neighbors. And as a result, I don't see this as weakening the West. If anything, I see it as emboldening the West. I see them, up until Russia invaded Ukraine, having a crisis of identity and a crisis of purpose. What the fuck is the point of NATO if there's no threatening Russia? What the fuck is the point of the EU if we have a bunch of dysfunctional asshole states that are all trying to go in their different directions? What's the point of a Western hegemony if, yeah, there's a lot of material benefits, but we're all a bunch of like soulless automata? And so that is where, for me, the Russian invasion has actually galvanized the West, not scared it. So, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, what you describe is a psychological regain, a kind of vigor that is being regained in the West. And I see the same thing. I agree with you. I just think that long term, civilizationally and intergenerationally, having a fur of the kind of Russia is a force of weakening, in the sense that the West won't be able to do whatever it wants and just wait for China eventually to get into the conflict, and you could have a world war. So I agree that you have a kind of minimal vigor heightening here happening. In fact, I think that this gain of vigor even applies to the left and the media in America and makes them better. For example, I've not seen CNN celebrate the birth of white babies for at least 5 years. And yet, since the Ukraine conflict, that's all they do. They film all these women in shelters and basement. Oh my God, white babies being born. And we need to protect them. And oh my God, they're the victim of shelling. You wouldn't have seen this for American white babies 3 weeks before the conflict, and yet you see this on an everyday basis. So there are some positives for the West here, but long term, The reason I think it's going to weaken the West is that I see China rising as the next superpower. If we want to make the parallel with Rome, eventually the American empire will have to fall. Nothing is forever. And one of the places where a future empire could rise is China. And in that rise of China, I expect both Russia and any force, in fact, that counters the American power, to eventually be a weakening force.
Okay, but this is where I'm wondering where you're seeing this strength. Okay, so I'm seeing Russian resistance, and maybe it's the propaganda that I'm consuming. But we assumed that like Russia was going to topple Kiev within a couple of days. It's like, I think it would take me longer to drive from here to Atlanta, Georgia, than it would be for people to drive from like Moscow to Kiev. Now, of course, there's like resistance and all that kind of shit, but we are talking about Russia, one of the most fearsome historical militaries in the world. And yet we're seeing them being held off by Ukrainian dickheads with tractors and modern Western weapons. So this is where, for me, watching I served in the military. I served in the military for 4 years, and there were lots of mistakes that we did. And these mistakes are often logistical, meaning that you don't have the people with the right material at the right place at the right time in order to launch a seamless operation. And what you need in order to launch an operation like that is lots of practice. And what I see with the Russians is I see men and I see equipment that should be capable of conducting this operation, and yet can't seem to get it going. And for me, that kind of shows, one, that the Ukrainians are fierce fucking bastards, and two, that the Russians are absolutely out of practice. And so for me, it's like I don't see a revitalized Russia seizing territory in order to challenge the global hegemon, and then China backing it into a new Cold War. I see China sitting on the sidelines, seeing how things are going to play out. And I see Russia not making the gains that they thought they were going to make as quickly. And one of the great ironies of this is like 6 months ago, we were talking about how like Russia had like all these like pro, male masculine recruitment ads, and the US military had all these like pussy, gay, I have two moms recruitment ads. And yet it seems like Globo Homo is kicking the shit out of the fucking masculine Russians. So what the fuck is going on?
Well, at least you have the presence of mind to consider the fact that you may be the victim of propaganda, because I think that's what's happening. The way I see it, ask yourself this question: could Vladimir Putin carpet bomb the entirety of Ukraine 2 hours from now? The answer is yes, basically. He has the arsenal to cover the whole of Ukraine with alpha particles and eradications through nuclear means, such that there would not be a single plant surviving in Ukraine. Yet he doesn't do it. And the reason he doesn't do it, there's a mix. First, I believe that he's trying to win a war with leftovers. When you look at the tanks that are burning, many of them are leftovers from the Soviet era. They are not even modern tanks bought this year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. They are tanks that come from another era of the military. Second, in terms of the artillery strategy, I think it's the lowest cost strategy. I think that Russia has built a strategy that we're going to win this with artillery that basically we would have nothing to do with if it wasn't for this. Thirdly, let's also recognize that America has been slower to dominate Muslim nations when it intervened in the Middle East than Russia currently is to dominate a European nation with white people in its Ukrainian armed forces. Those are very different things you can expect from a technologically advanced nation like Ukraine. And of course, it's a poor country, but it is more advanced and it is white and it is European. I wouldn't expect a country like this to be taken over by within 7 days. That would make no sense. That would be worrying. It would be worrying for any European nation if that was to happen. Also, a fourth point. I don't think that Vladimir Putin wants Kiev right now. I don't think he may not even want Kiev ever. What Vladimir Putin is doing right now is interfacing, and it's the right thing to do if you want to lead a low cost war. He's interfacing with the forces, detecting the pockets of resistance, and advancing where he wants to advance. Clearly, the primary strategic goal of this war is the advancement of the southern front, and it's going well. And the more this happens, the more it weakens the centers like Kiev, which eventually could be taken by Putin, depending on what he wants to do. So no, I think that you're taking things that are really part of the strategy of Putin and you're framing them, as CNN does and as MSNBC does, as evidence of a failure. It's not a failure. It's actually a form of military genius to be able to do this entire operation against a massively populated nation in an advanced nation with defense capabilities. To be taking them that fast as he did, which is faster, by the way, than many of the Middle Eastern areas that America has taken over, and to do it at low cost. In fact, today we've seen the first use of this new Dagger missile that hadn't been used throughout the war. Why hadn't it been used? Because Russia is using its lower tier material right now.
Yeah, I've heard this theory before, but I think it might be giving too much credit. And so hold on. So how long did U.S. forces need to take Baghdad,
Don't
Iraq?
forget, if you look at Baghdad, that we had 2 weeks of aerial bombardments before getting there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, 3 weeks, 21 days. Okay.
Well,
So
3 weeks of aerial bombardments, and I believe there were more days to get there, actually, by ground forces.
Well, right, but so my overall point so I took this point on, which is it is perhaps unrealistic to assume like so for instance, I would expect the war to be won. Okay? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, I'm surprised that Ukraine has held on this long. What I'm saying is I would expect we all grew up terrified of Russians. Okay? Could have been Cold War propaganda, but they're tough motherfuckers. And I think that if you look at history, this history is corroborated. Also, when you're talking about technology, you're talking about a near peer in technological advancement. Whether you're talking about like the Kalashnikov versus the AR platform, or the tanks like the Abrams versus like the T-14 Armada, or if you're talking about their fifth generation, stealth fighters or something like that, they're always supposed to be half a step behind us, to the point that we always push ahead technologically in order to keep up with them. And as you admitted, Ukraine is kind of like it's not the richest country in the world. It is a modern country, and also Western weapons and Western training have been flowing into the country for the past decade. So all of these points are well taken. But at the same time, what I would kind of expect is, with the kind of, I want to say like Russia is like number 6 in the world for like military spending per capita or something like that. I would just expect a little bit more progress, a little bit more cohesion, and I am watching lack of cohesion and kind of all this stuff. You say it's intentional, I say it's incompetence. I think time will tell. Okay. The thing that you said that I would actually be hopeful for is that Putin doesn't want Kiev. That's what I would be hopeful for. I I would be hopeful that the bombardment of Western cities in Ukraine without local Russian ground forces, that Kiev has been encircled but not taken, and that the East seems to be more of an incremental approach where they're trying to starve out Mariupol rather than just either flatten it or invade it. I hope that this is intentional to bring Ukraine to the table so they can take Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, and then come to a negotiated settlement with the rest of the territories. But then that's the question is, I don't fucking know, right? Because I'm not in Putin's brain. Does he want all of Ukraine? Does he want everything to the Central River? Does he want a puppet installation? Or does he just want these Russian majority areas? And by the way, these Russian majority areas, if it was originally like Ukraine who was being non-strategic with the negotiations of letting these territories go, then I can see from a pragmatic perspective of they just need to let these motherfuckers go, because you're inviting devastation into your country by continuing to hold on to Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. But at the same time, I think it's within Ukraine's right that if they give up Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, they can say, fuck you. You took shit that was historically ours. You took two of the most important ports in our country. As a result, the remainder of the country, the remaining of the territory that is ours, we are going to gravitate towards the West. We are going to try to become a NATO member. We are going to try to become an EU member because basically, we got into a pissing contest and you completely fucked me over. So, yeah.
Those are very interesting points. I wanted to get there, so let's get there. The problem with this kind of entitled approach that you present is that the more Zelensky acts in that way, the more it is tempting for Vladimir Putin to just take over the whole of Ukraine, or at least Kiev, and to cut at the 2/3 of Ukraine. The problem being, if there is truly a stubborn regime there to the west of Russia that really wants to join NATO, it will always be a problem. And the hate of the Ukrainians who will have survived the war and who will have been deported to whatever that area is will be forever, will be intergenerational, and will constitute a point of possible crisis for the future for Russia. So the more you adopt that attitude, the more you are basically a force of escalation, the same way America has been a force of escalation and Zelensky has been a force of escalation in this whole conflict. Let me remind you that the position that that you found was reasonable a few seconds ago, that was offered to Ukraine by Russia 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, the point of negotiation was if you can commit not to join NATO and if you can give DPR, LPR, and Crimea their independence, and Crimea would be recognized as a part of Russia because they voted for it, we'll just do a ceasefire and we will withdraw our troops. Zelensky decided not to accept this offer on the Russian side. Zelensky could have saved all of the human suffering that we've seen for the last 2 or 3 weeks.
What does that tell you about Ukraine's position, though? So for instance, this is where I'm at because I understand your 4D chess appeal. Okay, the thing about it is, we're all subject to the fog of war. We don't know what's incompetence and what's intelligence and all that kind of stuff. And what I see is a consistent flow of Western expertise and Western weapons flowing into Ukraine. And I see expensive pieces of Russian equipment getting fucking obliterated, whether that's attack helicopters, airplanes, fighter craft, transports, or tanks or transports. It seems like there is almost an unlimited supply of anti-tank and anti-air weaponry that's flowing into Ukraine. And it seems like the Russians are taking heavy losses. So what does it tell you about Zelensky and the Ukrainian government that they're not willing to take these terms? And by the way, one of the sticking points of these terms was that they had to reduce their military down to 60,000 or some shit like that. And so here's my problem with this negotiation is so you invade my fucking country and then you tell me that I have to reduce my armed forces. What's to allow me to prevent you from doing so again? Obviously, you're appealing to me from the Russian point of view. I'm appealing to you from the Ukrainian point of view, which is you are actively invading my fucking country and I am fucking up military forces right now. Do you think it's purely hubris on the point of Zelensky that he's not taking this deal? Or do you think there's more to the problem where the Ukrainians might be doing a little bit better than most people give them credit for?
It's partly hubris. It's also that Zelensky is confident that he can run a kind of underground cyberpunk type of resistance where underground forces and civilians of all kinds carry Molotovs and eventually surprise the Russians at every corner for the next 10 years and make this country so unmanageable that no one would want it. But I think it's a strategic error, and here's where it's hubris. It ultimately relies on the assumption that Putin, pissed off with with this kind of resistance, will not choose to level the place up, will not choose to use a nuclear weapon, tactical or not, against an entire city where such resistance would rise. And I think it's a stupid bet to make. I think that Zelensky is making bets with the lives of his people and his own life, potentially, if he's still in Kiev as he claims. He's making the bet that Putin won't be tempted to push on the nuclear button. and it's a risky bet to make. To me, that's more than hubris. It's risk
Well,
seeking to the point of self abolishment.
Okay, but here's my point, because oftentimes young people, they think that war is like a real-time strategy game, and that like there's assets that you put on the field that you can use in order to militarily destroy your opponent, and whoever wins that, basically has leverage at the table. There's this great Karl von Clausewitz quote, which is, war is diplomacy by other means. So leveling Ukrainian cities, nuking Ukrainian cities. Like, Russia is already pushed out in ways that we didn't think were imaginable. I'm pretty sure that it was said before the war that Russia being pushed out of the SWIFT banking system would be so catastrophic that basically it would be tantamount to a declaration of war by the Western world. And yet we did it anyways within a week of the war occurring. So I see a solidifying of the Western identity. I see a solidifying of like anti-Russian resistance, and I do see Russia potentially crumbling under the pressure. You say that basically this could be a 10-year war that's going to be detrimental to the Ukrainians. I'm saying that, yeah, it absolutely would fuck over Ukraine and turn it into a fucking hellscape. But I don't know how you fight a war for 10 years when your economy is collapsing behind you for a war that nobody wants, for strategic goals that you could have achieved through diplomacy. Like, literally all of this fucking shit could have been negotiated, and it wasn't. And it was on Russia thinking that it had more leverage than it did. And when it fucking didn't, it flipped the fucking table. So what the fuck does that say about like Russian ambition, that they're willing to piss away tens of thousands of lives, Ukrainian and Russian, in order to get something they could have done through negotiations?
I disagree that it's on Russia, because Russia's position, I find, was extremely reasonable. The idea of respecting the votes that already happened and where these regions of Ukraine don't want to be in Ukraine, that would have been easy to accept on Ukraine. And the idea of not being a military threat, I mean, anyways, this is what will end up with Ukraine, whether they want it or not. So
But
either you get your
will
military
you
blown up by the Russians, or you sign a treaty where you won't have them anymore. The way Japan did, by the way.
Well, okay, so let's follow this logic out. We accept a decent chunk of like Central American immigrants into the United States every year. Let's say that there was a Central American majority area of Texas, and they just vote, "Hey, we want to be independent republics, and we want to join Mexico." So, from a self-determinist perspective, just to get your level of consistency, you're saying they should be allowed to separate themselves from the United States and join Mexico. And if Mexico backed them, then they would be justified in doing so.
Absolutely. I'm a Quebecois separatist. I am for the
Ugh.
dismantling of these federal, especially if they are forced onto populations that do not want to be part of them.
Okay. All right. Well, at least we got consistency. That's nice.
Hopefully. Yeah, on the question of the use of the forces of Russia, I don't think that Russia I think you're saying that Russia is too extended and has used all of its reserves. I don't think so. I think Russia has barely put the energy that it needed to put in this war, and the progress is already spectacular. Look at Mariupol. I mean, it's been basically completely destroyed, and now the troops are in, and it's what's going to happen sequentially with more and more northern cities
But you
until
say these things, and unfortunately, I don't have the time to like check them. So, for instance, you say like Mariupol is a great victory. So, like, if I jump on the maps right now, and I look at Mariupol, and I use the thing, it's 22 miles outside of the Russian border. And you're saying a week into it, Mariupol is being taken. And for me, it's like 22 miles. Like, I used to drive further on my commute to work every fucking day. How is Mariupol not taken? And on top of that, this is like a combated. Was like a combated city for, I don't know, the previous decade between Ukrainian and Russian forces. So you're saying that they're putting a slow, steady squeeze. Okay, maybe it's a tactical thing. But at the same time, god damn, 22 fucking miles. Like I'm not gonna start busting out the white, red, and blue fucking flags for you being able to crush a single city 22 miles outside your border. Like celebrating that is weird.
Well, if you want more extension, consider Kherson and consider the
Mhm.
fact that the Russian military has progressed extremely well from Crimea to now Mykolaiv. And anyways, the idea is that the siege strategy that is being enacted here with artillery from a distance is a strategy where time is on your side. So if you wanted me to adhere to your view or kind of challenge my own view on this, you would have to convince me that time isn't on the side of Russia. What I see here is Russia benefiting from the extension of time, and so I will consider as a sieging entity against a siege entity
Mhm.
that they like that it's extending, because every day that passes is day that the civilians have less food, that they have less food to feed their own army, that the ammunitions are getting rarer, that the anti-air defenses are getting non-functional or are being all used. And so I think that time is still on the side of Russia for most of Ukraine to the east. Perhaps in Kiev there is still reapprovisioning happening, but perhaps Putin will get to a full siege of Kiev at some point. For
But
now, I don't see
you're
that that's the point of the progression on the map.
But your language kind of betrays exactly my fucking problem. Is like, okay, so real-time strategy or whatever the fuck. I think you're right. I think that if you're just looking at it from a who has more money, who has more time, who has more material, who has more soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of that, we don't really know the negotiated ends of Putin. Maybe he would be just okay with Donetsk, Luhansk, a drawdown of the enemy military, and basically like Kiev not joining NATO or some shit. Okay, maybe that's enough, and he would actually honor that agreement. That being fucking said, like it's not just a real time strategy game. The other factors are they're losing tons of fucking equipment and tons of dudes. And as unpopular as this is in Ukraine, this is probably also unpopular in Russia. And not just that. This is what we're talking about fighting and dying for. This is what we're talking about displacing tens of thousands of families for, killing kids, killing women, killing children, not just Ukrainian armed forces, but also Ukrainian civilians. We're talking about access to the fucking Black Sea. How could this not have been something that was fucking negotiated from Russia saying like, okay, Ukraine, you're an independent fucking state. You have somebody who's not fucking Russian friendly. That's okay. We're keeping the fucking Black Sea, and something that didn't need to result in literally an invasion that kills tens of thousands of fucking people. Why the fuck did
Well,
it have to come to this?
Russia tried this. It tried this many years ago when they had a
But
lease over
we're just gonna
Crimea.
cheat. We're just gonna
But
accuse
it's
each other of bad
important
faith here.
historically to note that Russia had a deal where they
Mhm.
were leasing a Crimean port, and so they had access to the Black Sea. Yanukovych had renewed this lease for something like 50 years, and this is what caused, partly, I mean, among other things, the whole revolution. So essentially, Russia had protected its interests through negotiation and diplomacy, but eventually it is the
You're
violence happening
okay.
inside
Do you
Ukraine
have
that made these treaties invalid.
Okay, do you have any evidence that these things could have been integrated at the same time? You're saying that Ukraine could not have been integrated into the EU and Russia maintained Crimea. Like you're saying that these things are completely opposed. That the second that Ukraine becomes NATO affiliated or becomes EU affiliated, Russia loses all access to the Black Sea. And none of this could have been negotiated. And basically it was just Ukraine unilaterally with like Western support was like, fuck you, Russia. We want to see you starve.
I mean, it's not what I said. First, the question of NATO taking over Ukraine is a question
Taking
that is much
over.
beyond just access to the Black Sea. It is not just access to the Black Sea, it is ultimately an existential threat for Moscow. And the problem
Okay,
you
can we
have
get
is
into that
supposed,
point? Why is NATO
yes,
an existential threat to Russia?
because if you have silos of missiles that can get to Moscow with a nuclear warhead within 7 minutes, then
Mm-hmm.
you have made Moscow your bitch. And you've done so in two ways. First, you are economically isolating Russia because then there's this whole territory to the west of Russia where anything you pass through, whether it's a pipeline, whether it's boats toward the Black Sea, whether it's transportation trucks, all of it would be subject to a pro-European power that wants to benefit from anything that comes out of Russia. Now, economically, from the standpoint of Russia, which is a large nation with a big surface area, which means a lot of resources. Essentially, the power of Russia into the future is that it will have more water than anyone, more wood than anyone, more logs, more trees, more minerals, simply because it's big. So from that perspective, having a blockade to your Western front that is possessed and controlled by American power is a big problem. And secondly, from an existential perspective, militarily, it is just not good to have this. What it means is that a Russian president that would take his own direction could eventually be hit directly in Moscow by American forces. So what we have is a reduction of the sovereignty of Russia going forward. It would have to be ultimately enslaved to American interest, or it would get hit.
Okay, so number one, we almost agree. Enslaved is a weird word, but like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these are already NATO countries, and they are as close to Moscow as Kiev is. And on top of that, NATO is like there would be no situation in which a NATO country would invade Russia unilaterally, and as a result, the rest of Europe would go to bat that country. It doesn't benefit Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Ukraine to invade Russia. So the existential threat of NATO, like you keep saying, like we're on the verge of invading them. But number one, that's not even how we fucking operate anymore. The global capitalist, I'm using the term derogatorily, but also descriptively, the Globo Homo project does not involve invasion. It involves economics. It involves diplomacy. It involves sanctions. War is oftentimes the very last resort. So that's where the security concerns, like they don't match reality. And then when it comes to the economic concerns, you're talking about competing on a sphere that they're going to have to compete on anyways. So even if they maintain their sphere of influence in Ukraine and they have a bunch of exports and they have to go through Belarus, Poland, whatever, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, these are still things that they're going to have to do. And what they basically did is they gave away the game. Instead of having the ability to have mild tariffs on their stuff while it's moving through these European markets, now they don't have access to European markets at all because they engaged in behavior that nobody can tolerate. And that's actually been the entire fucking problem. Is Europeans want to integrate Russia because it's a terrifying, powerful, rich, as you got Catherine the Great and the fucking Soviet flag behind you. It's an influential and powerful country, but then they do wild shit like this, and it's like, fuck you. Like, fuck you. Why would we deal with you if you're going to basically, I've said this before and I'll say it again, you're playing a 20th century game while everybody else is playing a 21st century game. What the fuck?
What you just described, I would call it, and I acknowledge that it's a subjective term for it, but what you just described, I call it the feminine, passive-aggressive approach of the modern West. And it's true, it doesn't always work through invasion, although it ends up in invasion when you make a stance. In other words, they will try to subvert Russia, and they will try to subvert them through diplomatic and dealings and maybe economic rewards. But when it boils down to it, when you have a country in the Middle East that truly stands against the interest of America, it ends up getting invaded. I'm surprised that you, as a soldier or an ex-soldier, you side up with such a feminine view of the world where, okay, the world has moved past physical violence, because the fact is it didn't. And to answer your point, I will explain Putin's view on this. Putin looks at these nuclear threats and the availability of a close strike to Moscow as being points that may never be used. If NATO took over Ukraine, and if there were silos of missiles ready to shoot toward Moscow, they may never shoot. But what will happen is they will have a leverage, and this kind of invisible leverage is a leverage that ultimately serves the interest of this kind of passive aggressive networking activity of the American empire. And what Putin wants is a future for Russia in which there is not that overarching threat, this ghost of the possibility of a strike, or this ghost of the possibility of a quick regime change operation in Moscow, which has happened historically. I mean, the Tsars in Moscow have been killed again and again. It wouldn't be surprising that the Americans could pull this in the modern time. So, and you talk about the sanctions. I will say on this, it seems that Putin has decided that Russia was gone its own way. And that I think he doesn't care at this point about these sanctions. And most importantly, as you've described, SWIFT is a big sanction, but it's probably the last sanction. I mean, what else can the West do? And so, in a way, all these sanctions going so fast against Russia will actually be a force of escalation, because you're not giving a reason for Putin to care about further escalation. What would be the punishment if Putin was to level a city in Ukraine right now? Would there be further punishment?
Yeah.
The means available become less and less interesting and less damaging for Russia. I think what I wish for Russia is to take its own direction and say, all right, all of these things that are being denied to us, and there's something to be said about the racism inherent to judging all Russians and targeting Russians for being Russians, which is what I see a lot in these sanctions. But what I want is Russia to take its own way and say, all right, if we don't have a PayPal access, we'll make our own PayPal. And if we don't have this and that, we'll make our own. And eventually Russia will be sanction proof, which is the desirable end state of all this.
Yeah, so I think that you gave me a lot. Number one, the one thing that you said a couple of times now that I think is just wrong is that like Russia is concerned that nukes will be stationed in Ukraine. We already have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We already have Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We already have submarines that can patrol in the Black Sea and the Baltic and all that kind of stuff. We have shit that's in Alaska that could basically hit Moscow within 30 minutes. And there's stuff in Moscow that could hit me within 30 minutes. We've had mutually assured destruction for the better part of a century. So that being part of the calculus doesn't make sense. Maybe having a mousetrap or a rat trap on your front door, where if militarily you hit somebody, you're going to get hit super fucking hard. I can understand that. But as long as you don't intend to fucking hit somebody, it's not a goddamn problem. So for instance, this is like, hey, you put, there's a rat trap like 6 feet ahead of you. Don't step in the fucking rat trap, and there's not a problem. So that's the defensive network, the NATO shit. I can see it from a Russian perspective, but I think it's bullshit. And I basically think that what's more important here, the thing that you've been talking about that I think is more relevant, is they don't want to integrate. They don't want to bend the knee. They don't want to be a part of Globo Homo. They don't want to be a part of the integrated European Western hegemony. And so they've made a choice where they've said, well, we thought about joining the club, but they don't fucking like us anyways. So fuck them. We're going to do our own shit. So we agree at least on that point. But this is kind of my thing is like Globo Homo, like having access to stable energy and stable markets in an integrated market system and all that kind of stuff. And sorry if I'm talking a lot, but you kind of give me a lot. Having all that shit seems weak and pussy and femme until you experience the alternative, which is blood and guts and death and fucking murder and slaughter and escape and deprivation and all that kind of shit. So we have a comfy, nice, clean world until it's not. And another thing that you said is like, oh, I'm surprised that you, as a military person, would flinch from violence. I don't flinch from violence, but like anybody who's experienced violence, I think violence should be minimized to the maximum degree possible. And so, like, that's where force, like use of force, killing people, is always supposed to be a last resort. And when we're talking about like rules of engagement, I do see a huge, massive moral difference between the ways that we've conducted war in the past versus the way that they're conducting war now. There was never a concerted since the Korean War, maybe since like Vietnam, there hasn't been an intentional like bombardment of civilian centers in order to bring another power to heel. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, when we look at how they bombard Middle Eastern cities and how these wars in
Would
those
you like to walk
centers,
me through that? Would you like me to walk me through any historical examples you have of Middle Eastern or North African cities being bombarded by American forces systemically to kill civilians? Do you want to give me
people are
any historical example in the past 50 years?
people are raising a very good example, which is Serbia. And it's a good example because it's not a Middle Eastern country, and it was an advanced nation in which buildings were bombarded in towns, like in towns where people were living. As far as the Middle Eastern
By
wars,
who?
I mean, it's the counts of civilian deaths are in the hundreds of thousands.
How?
Uh, how?
Yeah,
by,
how?
by
How did
guns,
those people die?
bombs, and destruction. And by the
And
way,
who
some of
killed
the
who?
prisoners
No,
we
no, no,
were
no. The
making, we were
reason,
torturing them. We were torturing them in
okay,
Guantanamo Bay.
but this is where like details absolutely fucking matter. And this is like an anti-leftist position, so I'm just gonna fucking go with it because I've been holding my tongue for a really fucking long time. The United States military did not kill 3 million or 2 million or 500,000 people in Iraq. They didn't kill 300,000 fucking people or 500,000 people in Afghanistan. What happened is we went into those countries, we toppled existing governments, we propped up governments, and we oversaw a civil war in which forces that we supported and forces that were indigenous fought each other for power and for the future of the country. So to say that that is morally identical to side with indigenous forces and fight alongside them within a country is the same as just fucking like burning an entire city to the ground is not correct, to put it politely. And then in Serbia, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, forgive me for remembering a little bit of history, but wasn't it like the fucking Serbs who wanted to maintain everybody within their sphere of influence? And when the Croats and the fucking Muslims broke off, they just started slaughtering the shit out of everybody. So all the people in your fucking chat who are pussy aching about NATO fucking bombing shit, no offense, you Serb cunts, but you fucking started it. So no, that none of the historical examples that you brought up are equivalent. And on top of that, I'll ask you again, can you bring up a single example in the past 50 years where America has said, here's a civilian center. In order to get what we want, we are literally going to bombard the entire fucking city and kill everybody in it? And the answer is you're not going to be able to give me that example because it doesn't fucking exist.
This speech was so ridiculous, I barely have to say anything. People are already laughing. The problem
Laughing
is,
because they're fucking retarded. Everything I
yeah,
said
well,
was accurate. What the fuck are you talking about? Do
here's
you
the
have an
problem.
example? Do you have an example?
Russia is not saying that they are intentionally targeting residential centers. In fact, they will have an explanation for each of the strikes they do. They will tell you there were Azov battalions in this building, and oh, there was a tank hidden in this parking space. And so the same applies to your analysis of America's intervention. Then it applies to Russia. Russia is trying to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Perhaps there are collateral damages in the same way that there were collateral damages in the strikes of America. But in the bombardment in Serbia, there were definitely buildings that seemed just as residential as those buildings that you see crumble here in Ukraine. And, you know, as far as I know, in Serbia, there weren't neo-Nazi battalions supporting the local regime.
Okay, you've asserted this point like 2 times in the past 3 minutes. Is there like a moral difference for you between somebody who claims specifically to be a neo-Nazi, which by the way, the Azov battalion is like 2,500 people out of 300,000 fighting men and women inside Ukraine. So this like consistent bringing up of Azov battalion is like, you're calling my perspective ridiculous. Your chat is fucking laughing. Are you fucking kidding me? This is like the dumbest shit that could be brought up. And then, okay, so is there a moral difference between fucking dumb fuck LARPer neo-Nazi dickheads flying a swastika on their fucking armband versus the Serbian fucking forces that said, "Oh, you're a Croat. Oh, you're a fucking Muslim. We're just going to fucking mass execute you." Do you find a large moral difference between these people?
Well, I disagree with your presentation here. I don't think it's a
Which
fair
one? Which
representation of
part?
the.
Which part of my presentation do you disagree with?
Well, I don't think that the Serbians were saying that. I think that there were legitimate issues in Serbia. There were
Okay.
legitimate worries about what centers of the city were becoming and how they were taken by forces that were very much anti-Serb. And so it's much more complicated than this. But
Okay.
as far as the
Genocide
neo-Nazis,
usually is.
I don't want to offend the neo-Nazis in the audience. All I'm saying is, you guys, neo-Nazis of Ukraine, you were becoming an existential threat through your action, through the corruption that you were allowing in the areas you were controlling, and some outside area decided to deal with that existential threat. Sorry.
Okay, so just to be clear, what you just said is 2,500 Nazi militia members out of a 300,000 strong army, led by a Jewish fucking president, was an existential threat to Russia. I just want to be clear that that's what you just said.
No, I understand that not all Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. I'm saying they were led to develop too much in a way that became a threat to Russia, and so there had to be some action. And there was just too much genocidal activity in the southeast of Ukraine. So someone had to deal with it. I'm actually thankful that this genocidal activity is being neutralized by Putin.
Okay. So if the population of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, so even by your own estimations, 15,000 people have been killed since 2014. But this is a genocide, a slow rolling genocide in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. So
By the
what is the
definition,
population?
by
Oh,
the
so now
definition
we're going to
of the
talk about
United
language.
Nations, by
Uh-huh.
the definition of the United Nations of genocide, any measures taken to make life miserable or make it harder for someone to live on their territory or to function normally is a form of genocide. So it's false to claim that a genocide has to be accomplished before you call it a genocide. There is a genocide going on in what I've described, in the deprivations of right, in the deprivation of public employment, in the deprivation of bank services to the populations of Donbass. And on top of it, there's the killing, yes.
Okay, so do you? I don't even need to start fucking defending genocide in order to fucking try to get it own. But like, looking, I know we're coming up on 90 minutes. If Russia took Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea and left the rest of Ukraine to self-determine as it saw fit, would that be a decent ending to this conflict for you?
To me, at this point, it would be unsatisfactory, but I understand that Putin is
What's
softer than
left? What's
what?
left? What's left? What
What?
else would you want?
At this point, I think it would be desirable for Putin to take at least 2/3 of Ukraine, if not all. But I know that Putin is softer than me, so I don't know where he will converge. But I think at this
What
point, it
2/3?
has
Because you've said 2/3 before. There's the river.
the easternmost 2/3 basically go further than the Dnieper River and take up to the Transnistria region.
So you would want him to have the southern 2/3 of the country?
The eastern 2/3, including Kiev, Transnistria, up to Transnistria, basically, and including Mykolaiv and all the cities in between Mykolaiv and Zhytomyr.
Okay, so you would say Zhytomyr West, whatever is
Zhytomyr would be,
of the Ukrainians could have.
yes. But I mean, personally, I would think that the whole of Ukraine must be taken over. But that's because I think that given the state of the current war and the amount of expenses that it has generated and the sanctions that were entered, I think that the cost has become so great that minimalizing the territorial domination at this point would only create a whole area of Western Ukraine, which would be extremely hateful against the Russians going forward, and which would be ultimately a security threat intergenerationally.
So what's the solution?
I would hope that the corrupt regime of Ukraine can fall, either fall on its own or eventually lose the military battle, and that some form of a kind of sovereign province of Ukraine can exist. Would it be within the Russian Federation or simply within the Russian Empire, seen as broad? I don't care that much. All I think would be best is that the corrupt elites that have taken over and that have juiced it basically with the intervention of American elites. I would want them to be gone, and I would want the Ukrainian people to live as they want, but as they want, without a way as to without oppressing their Russian ethnic minorities, and with respecting the desire of everyone to lead sovereign lives and to have freedom also from Ukraine for those who want it.
All right, Pedro. I think I'm good. I think I might be getting triggered. So
No,
the
that's understandable. Well, then you want to give just a last closing statement, and then we'll move
yeah.
into JF's closing statement, and then I actually do. I wrote down a lot of questions. I was keeping track of a lot of things.
Yeah,
And
and I
then,
and JF, I still respect your intellect. I just don't respect some of your perspectives. But if you want to go first, I just want to take some notes.
Okay, well, I don't have much to say. I kind of already did my concluding statement, but yeah, you cannot be in a world where large, broad accession of liberties and sovereignty are respected, but when subsections of these entities want to separate, want to lead a sovereign life, suddenly it is denied. There is something arbitrary in any imperialist thinker who wants to form federations that are binding onto its subsection or sub-provinces. And this arbitrariness shows in the scale of the power they want to project. So, for example, here Counterpoints was alarmed if Texas wanted to separate from the US, he would not want it to happen. Well, I say if Texas would be filled with Mexicans who feel more Mexican than they feel American, it would be in a way very good for Texas to separate from America, and I would be the first to root for it. The same applies to these eastern region and southern regions of Ukraine, which didn't feel comfortable with the violent takeover of their regime in 2014, and who immediately were alarmed at the fact that a different ethnic, the Ukrainians, were taking over a country in which up to then they had been able to live in. And in fact, they had been able to have their own candidates in the presidency in the form of Yanukovych. When these people, these ethnic Russian minorities, saw the violent takeover of their regime, many of them wanted out of Ukraine, and it should have been respected. But it wasn't respected because people like Zelensky and his partners and those who preceded him wanted to keep these units, DPR, LPR, and Crimea, inside Ukraine so they could continue this kind of imperialist domination over people that didn't want to live with them anymore. So I say respect sovereignty, and you won't end up in a situation like Ukraine is right now.
all right, and counterpoints. Did you want to still give a closing statement, or how?
I do. I just got to put in one last sentence. Fuck. I'll just go for it. So okay. So what I would say is calling Ukraine corrupt and saying that it should fall back into the orbit of Russia is laughable. All of the fucking problems that Ukraine has, Russia has just as much, if not more. And pretending that these problems are going to be like remediated through Russian influence, I think is not borne out by any analysis of geopolitics or history. Ukrainian self-determination. We talked about, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea. Okay, fuck it. Russia has geopolitical interests that these places are majority Russian. They want to break off. That should have been respected. I can almost go with that. But then the same way that those regions voted majority to go with Russia, if the majority of Ukraine wants to become part of NATO, EU, or a part of the Western hegemon, then that equally should be respected without resorting to violence. War should be the last resort. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. Putin is playing a 20th century game in the 21st century. And while war is still something that can happen, we are being pretty cavalier about people getting fucking artillery bombarded, shelled, mortared, blown the fuck apart. And if my distaste for that seems obvious, that my distaste is stemming from the fact that I think this should be done absolutely when necessary, and being indiscriminate with the way that you're conducting things is fucked up. And the reason why I kept bringing up and pressing for historical examples in which the United States or the global homo Western hegemony has conducted itself militarily the same way that Russia has within this previous conflict is because I don't think there's historical example within the past 50 years. And the historical examples that you could cite in Vietnam and Korea were due to limitations in technology, tactics, and imagination, not through some fucking bloodthirsty fucking desire on behalf of Americans in order to slaughter brown and black people. All of Russia's goals could have been achieved through diplomacy and integration. This is actually extremely frustrating to me as somebody who like doesn't personally vilify or hate the Russian people at all. I actually wish that they could have been integrated into Europe, but this brings on to the question about global homo versus isolationist nationalism. Is liberalism, is having universal human rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, the right to self-defense, and limited government, are these universal principles, or are these only American principles? And is it America's job to export these principles culturally and economically to the globe, and only you as an individual can answer those questions? I was very happy when JF had the moral consistency to say that if a group of people wanted to break off into a self-determined republic or nation or whatever, and they had the popularity to do so, that he would support that. I wasn't happy with the inconsistency over corruption and the juicing of Kiev by US and Russia. I think these things are demonstrably not equivalent, and having some of these things be made equivalent was a little frustrating for me. And basically, I wish the Ukrainians Godspeed in their conflict. I hope the people in Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea can break away and have their own peaceful union with Russia. And I hope all of the people west of pretty much Kharkiv, in Kharkiv and west and north of Mykolaiv and Odessa, I hope those people can join a free and united Ukraine that can do whatever the fuck it wants with its destiny going forward. And I'll leave it there.
Awesome. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the point on the program where we consider the debate officially over. At this point, I, the moderator, get to ask some questions to both debaters that I caught during their discussion that I wanted to inquire upon more, with a more critical eye. And then after that, we'll go into audience questions. So, JF, do you mind if I focus on you first?
Sure.
Can I grab water while you're getting focused on?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because I'm talking JF mainly on this one. 41 minutes into the program, you said to Counterpoints that he's a victim of propaganda. What network of information do you have access to that we do not, that makes your opinion immune to propaganda and therefore more informed than our own?
I don't think my opinion is immune to propaganda, and I don't watch specific networks that would differ from his. I think every source everything that he mentioned, I was exposed to because I refresh CNN on an everyday basis. I watch MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, that kind of stuff. So it is not through my accessing different networks that I access different information. It is through the critical review. Because I'm a scientist, people who don't know me may not know, but I'm a scientist first and foremost, not a political debater originally. And as a scientist, I always ask myself, the person communicating some information to me, do they have direct access to it? Does CNN know what Putin thinks? Does CNN know what soldiers think? Are they fit to evaluate troop morale? And the answer is they're not. They're not fit for this. And so whenever you have these people come to you and say, oh, the Russians have low troop morale, they don't know. They have no clue. Because to evaluate troop morale, you would have to have a one-on-one discussion with various soldiers, and they don't do it. They don't engage with Russian soldiers that way. So ask yourself always when you receive a piece of information, is the person communicating that to me fit to give me that information?
Understood. All right, and my next question would be still on UJF. At one point, you said, even in your opening statement, you said even someone like yourself would be jailed in Russia. But then later on, you said this country, being America, is destroying you at the same time. But you're not in jail with us, so I'm trying to figure out: can you square that circle for us?
Well, what I'm saying is that in Russia, because I'm a contrarian, I would probably find a way to offend the regime at some point in Russia, and perhaps I would end in jail. It was a comment in jest. I don't know for sure that I would be, but it's a possibility. I'm not in jail in the American regime. However, the American regime has canceled me in ways that I could argue are almost as bad as jail. The American regime will take your children. The American regime will keep you from having financial services if you are an ideological dissident. And in a way, the American regime, I perceive it as a open sky jail. They will attack your family. They will keep you from being a parent. They will destroy your family ties, and they will also torture you through deprivation of job opportunities and bank opportunities. So in a way, to me, that's almost as bad as jail.
Okay. And then my last question for you, JF, is: do you really want to see the destruction of America? And if I'm using false language, if I mischaracterize it there, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But that's what in my summation, I'm thinking JF wants to see the U.S. fall.
Yes, I want a future in which America is not a thing anymore. There will still be the land that was there. But basically, to be respectful, I would say I want a parking space project for the territory that currently is North America. I think it would be better than the current corrupt regimes that head our nations.
Understood. All right. And then to you, Counterpoints. Your question, you were questioning Russia at one point for why it hasn't absolutely destroyed the Ukraine because of its obvious, it's supposed to be superior, right?
Mhm.
My question would be this: do you automatically think, since the Russians are going to invade Ukraine, that they're automatically going to say scorched earth policy, mow everything down in sight and go in? Or do you feel that there's more of a tactical acquisition of the land taking place? Like we want, like, JF, would you say they're trying to grab Ukraine, correct?
Well, there are some indications that they're not trying to grab Ukraine. The way Putin offered very early DPR, LPR, Crimea independence, and then no NATO membership, and we're going to leave you alone. I think this offer was so generous that you have to consider the possibility that Vladimir Putin was not initially interested in taking over Ukraine. That's the way I see it. Let's also mention that Ukraine is unmanageable. I mean, I don't know if Vladimir Putin would want it if it was given to him.
Okay. So counterpoints, would you hear what he's saying there? And would you say, instead of just going in and mowing down everybody, because I have the military power to do so, would you maybe at least see that they're trying to use some tactical capability to say, yes, I'm going to have some civilian casualties. Yes, it's going to get bloody, but I'm going to do it to the most, minimal way possible. Is that at all
Yeah,
possible?
so yes, and JF gave me room for thought on that because I feel like even an incompetent military should have been able to pull this off. Strategic, not tactical. As a matter of fact, a lot of what I would be arguing would be tactical problems are visible. So there's been unsupported helicopter landings in Ukraine. Uh, American military doctrine would basically dictate that you get control of the skies and have air support on standby and have mechanized supports on standby and support your troops and this, that, the other. And it just didn't happen. It just seemed like Russian forces were half-assed being thrown into Ukraine. And so tactically on the ground level, this does look like a lot of incompetence, does look like a lot of lack of coordination, does look like a lot of lack of experience. But I will consider going forward what JF said, where maybe they don't want to dominate. Maybe it's all a show of force. Maybe they're trying to strangle the areas that they see as important. But ultimately, they don't care if they take the whole thing. They just want leverage. And I'll try to think about that as I watch the events unfold going forward.
Got it. Okay. In the 55-minute mark, Counterpoints, you seem to be really wanting Russia to go for a diplomatic solution, right? And JF kind of seeded in the conversation at one point that diplomatic or economical how would you say, treaties, some kind of agreements, that's very feminine energy, and that's the way that's the way that they're conducting their spreading of Glomo Homo. So to play the diplomacy game, the make a trade deal or some kind of treaty game, that's automatically playing into the enemy's hands, and it should be done through force. Why do you think it? And I would say I'm with you here because I would say I don't trust Russia. I don't see them actually stopping. Why do you think they should? What would put it in Putin's mind to come to the table if he, in fact, does have JF's way of thought on diplomacy, treaties, and such, and economic, sharing and stuff like that?
Yeah, so if Putin was more femme, I think JF already said that he was he was feminine thinking because he wanted to negotiate so early. The the I think this is the nature of it, and also it's kind of easier to say that like force is the more masculine thing to do, and globo homos manipulations through this, that, the other thing are more femme, and
Well, I'm
I
sorry.
think
Can I
that's all
stop you
easy
for
to
a
say.
second?
Sure.
Can I stop? It's not that it's femme, right? And it's not
Hmm.
that war is masculine. It's
Hmm.
the fact that both sides think that if I play either other's game, I do not get. I play into the other person's hand.
Yeah.
So really, I'm trying to figure out this, and this kind of goes to my next question.
Oh, did I lose
Why,
you
if
guys
I'm
again? Are you
Putin?
kidding me?
Oh, did you lose calorie points? Can you hear us?
Now, while he fixes this, I want to specify I didn't say that the only way to be a man is to engage in the forced fight. I said that there was a way in which imperialistic domination of the US spreads that is feminine. And that way is through manipulation, through, and it's not just treaties or deals or non-violence. It is that it's a form of violence, but it's a form of violence that is not physical, that is not illustrated. And it's how certain nations like the US are intimidating other nations in bending to their will. That's what I was describing. And I'm not saying if you fight, you're a male, and if you don't fight, you're a female. It's much more subtle than this.
Huh. Okay. So there was a moment that you would
JF,
say,
stop fucking with my internet, okay? Jesus.
Okay, I will call my Russian hacker friends and I will tell them to calm down.
Thank you. So hold on. So I'll answer on my shitty mic, and then if you want to ask JF a question. So basically, like I just think I heard what he said, or at least I heard the last 10 seconds of it. Um, I think we have to get away as a political community, like the online Twitch, Twitter, BitChute, Odyssey community. We have to get away from thinking of war as separate from diplomacy. These are one and the same. So basically, anybody who's engaging in any kind of militaristic force, they're trying to achieve a diplomatic goal, whether that's access to like material goods or access to a certain part of the region or this, that, the other. And so you do have to think about it. Okay, I'm resetting the internet. Basically, you have to think about it in those terms. So there's a spectrum, and you have to be willing to like negotiate the entire thing of the spectrum. My frustration is I know that there's young people, young Russians and young Ukrainians who are now dead, who didn't need to be dead. JF is blaming the Western hegemonic project because they're the ones who forced Russia's hand. I'm blaming Russia because their goals probably could have been achieved through diplomacy. So that's where Unfortunately, we have to meet somewhere in the fucking middle.
Yeah. My question would be this then. For the last 20 years, right? I heard this and I checked it. For the last 20 years, NATO has been grabbing nations that are, bordering Russia. Is that fair to say? Would you both agree?
I wouldn't,
Yes.
because grabbing
Well, not grabbing.
insinuates,
Oh,
so
my
so
sorry,
this is
not
a
grabbing, but nations have been joining NATO for the past 20
okay.
years that are face
Mhm.
to face with Russia's border.
Yeah, but if I could explain this really quickly, like, because this is actually like a difference in vision between me and JF.
Mhm.
So basically, like, when a country joins NATO, there might be, quote unquote, like, global homo cosmopolitan interest there, where they want access to trade, they want access to the European markets, they want access to American military backing, they want access to this technology and this, that, the other. But it's not like you join NATO and then US troops show up and they start butt stroking your fucking women in the face with M4 rifles. That's not what happens. So basically, that's where, for me, a defensive alliance between countries with aligned interest is a lot different than a literal takeover of the country by your nationalist forces. These are different things.
Understood. And I was just trying to get to this because there's the other side of the coin where I would say and ask JF, why in the world would Putin ever stop advancing?
Well, there's no sign that Putin has ambitions to dominate further, first. Second, there are costs that would increase as he would be advancing. And there's a question about whether it would be of any use to him. I mean, we know what's the fate of overextended empire. History is not very good to them, and I think that Vladimir Putin is a great man of history who really has an understanding of what it means to have an overextended empire. Germany didn't last long when it started invading other European countries, and the same fate could happen to Russia if it was too aggressive. So, those things are things that he will consider. I think that Vladimir Putin would be happy having realized the domination of Ukraine and dying that way and leaving that as his legacy for Russia.
Okay. We can get into more, but I have a lot of audience questions and I got this one queued up, so I'm going to post it on the screen. It's from Jonathan Dow with a $2 donation, sir. I did not miss any of your super chats. I marked them all down. I just didn't want to interrupt the flow of these guys' conversation. And his question is, what benefit does a US citizen see if US engages?
Zero
Uh,
benefit. I mean, you will have the benefit of feeling stronger family ties as you experience the threat of a nuclear attack on your city. You'll see that this fear inside of you might increase the ties of love inside your family.
you no. There's a $65 trillion global economic empire that you are currently a part of, whether you like it or not. Ukraine is equally becoming a part of that global economic empire. So you have to decide: do you like your fucking Funko Pops? Do you like your access to cheap Mexican avocados? Do you like this global material comfort that we've all become a part of, or are you like a isolationist nationalist? And so, depending on how you answer that question, will determine whether or not these things are good or bad.
Well, there's a problem in your vision, and it's basically inherently expansionist. The current material comfort that we have doesn't depend on Ukraine being part of NATO or being part of a global trading network. Ukraine, I mean, other than through its exports of food, of course. But this export of food could come from Russia also if we weren't canceling Russia. So it's kind of interesting that do you feel entitled to conquering new nations into this kind of global framework that you present for our material comfort?
Well, so that brings up an interesting definition of conquer. So is basically integrating a foreign nation into this, cosmopolitan internationalist capitalist empire. If you integrate it, if it's relatively voluntary on the behalf of that country, is it conquering in the same way that like national level conquests are? My answer is no. And while there's plenty of downsides to the global economic order, I do think that it's preferable to the alternative, because the alternative is nationalist war.
So you're not conquering, you're liberating.
It depends. Spiritually, I think that the Western hegemonic project is necessarily spiritually bankrupt because it's liberal, right? You believe what you want to believe. I believe what I want to believe. And as long as we can cooperate economically, then we can cooperate, right? That's like the liberal capitalist project. So it doesn't offer any solutions to a lot of what human beings need in order to thrive as people. And so I think that's the problem with it. But I don't think that's a challenge that is answered by revisiting nationalist level war. I think we need to become better human beings. So
Gotcha. Um, I just had a question pop in my mind. JF, uh, Ukraine totally taken over by Russia, Putin, right?
Yes.
Wouldn't that still mean that Russia and now even Ukraine itself both will be cut off from the world market entirely?
Well, there's a good question about whether the sanctions would continue and whether they, or if they do continue, whether it would hurt in the end those people who it was meant to protect. Presumably, the Western powers would eventually change their stance and would find more targeted ways to not hit the the civilian populations of Ukraine. But you're right; it could lead to a kind of collateral damage. These sanctions, and I think it already does, in that it strikes the level of well-being of the basic civilian Russian population. And Bill Maher was starting to complain about this, that we're essentially developing an anti-Russian sentiment as a whole. And even those who oppose the war, not me, but those who oppose it, should concentrate on the regime of Vladimir Putin.
So I'm just thinking through this. It will be up to the sentiments of the world markets people to say, yes, you did take over that place. Congratulations. Now we will let you back into the market because we don't want to hurt your people.
I think that this will be the kind of excuse they will pull. First, the question of whether Russia will be sanctioned forever or whether it's a short thing ultimately boils down to how much do Western politicians need Russian resources. And I think they need it very much. I think they might need it more than they think right now. So ultimately, it's a matter of power. If someone has something you want and you need, and if your population are suffering, you'd be an idiot not to allow them to trade it to your population. So when the gas gets so rare, when the reserves of the U.S. Gets empty, when the food becomes to lack for Europeans, there will be a strong drive to accept, to undo the Russian sanctions, and in fact welcome Russian products. And because of the size of Russia, Russia will always have this upper end in terms of natural resources.
Right.
I think Russia's
And
way
I
more
just want,
fucked than we are.
yeah,
Uh, uh,
yeah. Oh, sorry. Counterpoints. Go for it.
No, I was just gonna say I understand the logic behind JF's statements, but to pretend that this isn't fucking hurting Russians, but somehow like the entire 65, you were just talking 20 fucking seconds ago about how like, oh, do you necessarily need to integrate Russia and Ukraine into the $65 trillion empire? No, our food supply. The only thing that's gonna be fucked over is natural gas for Europe, which Germany is primarily reliant upon. That's the main fucking problem. But guess what? There's plenty of other fucking ways in order to figure that shit out. Maybe not immediately, but there's plenty of stopgaps that can be taken. Russia is going to hurt way more than the Europeans are. Europeans are going to hurt, but nowhere near as fucking bad as the Russians. And honestly, I see them coming back into the fold faster than fucking Europeans are like, oh, well, I want natural gas and Russian timber, so fuck it.
We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
You're right.
JF, I will say this. I do share your sentiment of brutality. Like, for example, if I was a general in Israel during the 6 Day War, it would have been the sixth war month because of me. Because if I was a general, I would have just glassed the earth. But and I would have taken this mentality. If I take this mentality over to the situation right now, if I was on the world stage and I'm looking at you and you take Ukraine because you're Russia, right? I wouldn't open back up any of the markets. I would do that brutal thing that I think you would advocate for. I would let you starve. And it's like the moment I think earlier you said in debate, it's either Russia is going to learn to say, hey, they ejected us from PayPal. We're going to make Russia pal. There's no McDonald's. We're going to make Rush Donald's or something like that. It would be up to
There's
you.
actually the trademark for the Russian McDonald has already been registered. It's a McDonald arc, but it's turned to form a B, so it's kind of McDonald.
Right. But I'm thinking this: you independently, Russia, and now with the land of Ukraine, won't you have a harder time doing those things? Whereas we're going to have to do the same thing because, like you said, we rely on a lot of your resources, right? But then we would just probably with the full, we still have the access to the world market, any other country, and we would just say, all right, we're going to do what JF said, but we're probably going to do it faster and more efficiently, and it's probably going to get going because we have just the sheer numbers right there because you have the rest of the world versus Russia. I just don't see the market just reopening to you.
I
That's
think
the only
you're
thing.
naively thinking, you're naively misunderstanding what sanctions are.
Okay.
Sanctions are not an effective military siege tactic. Sanctions are a way to moral display to your own population if you're a Western politician that you're doing something. At least we're doing something to help the children of Ukraine. The minute it starts mattering, the minute the full leverage of the superiority of natural resource availability shows and ends up in the suffering of Western population, you'll realize something. It's that in a trade, there are two players. One is selling, one is buying. And when that trade doesn't happen against the will of the two players, it hurts both sides equally. And when the West realizes that it is hurting itself as much as it is hurting Russia, they will eventually slowly get away from this moral display, which has mediatic functions, but which is not a true leverage point over Russia.
Gotcha. And thank you, Jonathan Dow, for your $5 making it rain tonight on the moral display shown by U.S. when it admitted its sanctions killed 500,000 civilians. We appreciate your donation, sir. Next one comes from Michael X for $10. The U.S. is backing the Saudi war in Yemen, where the Gulf monarchs are set to kill millions of children through a man-made famine. Putin is Mother Teresa compared to U.S. Zionist foreign policy. I mean, that's
Cool.
kind of counterpoints. Would you want to interact with that? Because if that's true, that does kind of that's some weight right there, right?
Yeah, so we would have to basically bust into an entire other geopolitical conversation. The fucking I forget if it's the Houthi rebels. I think it's the Houthis. They're supported by Iran. They have a foothold in Yemen. Yemen is a fucking mess, to put it lightly. And there's no way that Saudi Arabia would ever tolerate like a fucking Iran aligned Yemen on its southern border. I think that humanitarian aid has been getting in. I think you're literally like your news clip is like 2 years, like your soundbite. I'm pretty sure is like 2 years old. I'm pretty sure that like humanitarian aid actually has been getting into fucking Yemen, but I would literally have to start Googling to see how full of shit that poster is. So we'll see. But let me concede where I can concede. Energy policy, the American and Western aligned energy policy allows us to be barbaric fucking cunts because we will look the other way on notoriously evil shit as long as it's done by people we need. So I can concede that at least.
Gotcha. Justin L 614 $10 donation. We appreciate it, sir. To JF, you say Russia will reduce the power of the U.S. and the West, but it would seem that every war increases the power of the U.S. Multiple decades in the Middle East only increased our imports.
Yeah, I think that Russia could temporarily strengthen the US, temporarily strengthen the drive for NATO and for Europe, but long term, Russia constitutes an opposite force. And when there's ultimately a conflict between the US and China, Russia will be a force pulling the US down or making any such conflict much, much harder for the US and much more costly. So that's how sometimes you have to look at history. It is you want your enemies to be wearing themselves down into inexistence. And I think that Russia is a positive force to have for this.
Gotcha. Norm Kelly, thank you for your $5 donation. She says, or he says, you don't never know these days. Russia, the separatist region, in exchange for help removing corrupt Zelensky regime. Do either of
It's
you
not
want to
going to
interact with
happen.
that?
It's not going to happen. Either Russia's going to kill Zelensky or he's going to stay in power. So, if they actually do take Kiev, if they actually do kill Zelensky, I think the game changes because the Ukrainians lose one of their major symbols for resistance. I think at that point, if they start assassinating the other opposition leaders, it kind of all falls apart. But if they don't kill Zelensky, then I think Zelensky stays in power. So.
All right, Chronic Boom for $5. You can tell which side of a conflict is the underdog by whose race gets called the C word. Counterpoints racial slurring of Serbs is very revealing. I never heard you racial slur the Serbs, did you? Or
Croats?
Yeah,
maybe
he
I don't know
kind
what
of
a
did.
racial slur for the Serbs are. What? Or never mind. Don't say it. Don't say it.
No.
Let's hope. Let's yeah.
The Croats are a different ethnic group. What are they talking about?
I, I
So,
do
so,
not
so
know.
there's different ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia. There's Croats, there's Serbs, and there's like I forget the fucking term, but the goddamn Muslim fucking Bosnians. So pretending I don't know if they're saying that Croats is a fucking slur for Serbs or Croats don't exist, but Croat separatism is what kicked off the fucking that war. So I don't know what the fuck they're talking about.
Gotcha. From Jonathan Dow for counterpoints. If both sides are so corrupt, why assign either as good? Why not leave the shithole Ukraine to Russia? Is there a U.S. interest that is not corrupt? Is not corrupt intervention?
No, but it's all a question of degree, and this is where I would ask people to kind of grow up a little bit. I think that like one of my great realizations, I thought I went to war for Jack Daniels and strippers, and when I learned that I went to fucking war with Funko Pop or for Funko Pops, I think that kind of pissed me off for a little bit, and I was like, oh well, I thought I was fighting for American national interest, but I was really fighting for the international global economy. But then I kind of realized the international global economy is important. I interact with it every single day. My life is good because of it. There's a lot of integration and cross cultural pollination that's occurring, and you can decide whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing based off of your perspective. If we were to historically analogize this, I view the United States as the new Rome, and I'm a fucking Roman. I support Rome, hell or high water. So that's kind of the way that I feel about it. So it's degrees of corruption and it's like utilitarian good. What do you think makes the most amount of people happy, successful, at peace, and able to live productive lives?
I might suggest a title for your autobiography, Diaries of a Cocked Consumer.
Can I suggest one for you? Diaries of a fucking cucked conservative bootlicking a fucking Russian autocrat.
I love it.
All right,
All right.
perfect. As long as we're both fucking cucks. All right, there we go.
All
God
right.
damn.
Blood has been spilled. Okay. Zen Shapiro for counterpoints. You addressed a major problem of identity crisis slash lack of purpose in humanity. What is your solution for this problem? Do you believe there's a purpose to life?
Yes. I am a Gnostic. That term has been like a Gnostic perennial deist. I'm not a Christian per se, but I think like Christian religion offers a lot of insight into the way humans should conduct themselves in order to be happy and healthy and functional. I think that the problem is that I know I'm on a right wing show. I don't believe in Christianity or religions literally, but I think they have a lot of the solutions to the failure in purpose that humans have. Liberalism is a structure. It's not a solution. It's a structure through which many people can participate and coexist peacefully. It does not give you the meaning to life. Materialism, hedonism, nihilism, self centeredness, these are all evils that humanity has been battling for the past, like, I don't know, 100,000 years. And while I'm not a literalist, I do think that religion and spiritual contemplation do offer solutions to these problems.
Brother, if you're borrowing our book, why don't you just join a team? I swear. We'll
Uh,
welcome you home. Did you want to interact with that, JF? Do you have the meaning of life in your back pocket?
No.
Listen, he's French descended. There's no fucking way. Bunch
Well,
of
dude,
nihilist fucking cunts. As a matter of fact, like, I know he's Quebecois. I know he's fucking Quebecois or whatever, but literally the people who he's fucking descended from got us in this fucking mess in the goddamn first place by exploring existentialism and nihilism. So blame the fucking French, okay?
I don't think the French are that bad. What percent are you French, JF?
Are they that bad, JF?
100%. 100. There is 0% of my genetics that's anything else than French.
Okay, and how responsible are the French for fucking up the existential lives of Western humanity?
I mean, they gave you John Calvin. I'll be honest.
Any problem that could be assigned to existentialism stems from the very fact of existence. So anyone who exists ends up inheriting these problems. The French have nothing to do with it.
Sounds like passing the buck.
Gotcha. And then let's move on to our next question coming right up here. It's from Andrew Stott to JF. You seem to suggest any country taking over Ukraine would have been better for it if it had been in a better standing than Ukraine. What other countries would you support invading?
It's hard to find a country that's as bad as Ukraine. I mean, human trafficking, 300,000 victims over the few decades, a murder rate of 3.4, basically anything that... And Ukraine is so much at the bottom of the barrel that any nudge, any kick in any direction will make it go up.
Okay, did you just say a homicide rate of 3? Is it 3.4 per 100,000? Is that what you were saying was the fucking thing? That's like,
so 4 times higher than Poland.
Okay, you understand the United States has like a standing homicide rate of like 5 per 100,000, right?
Perhaps, I don't know, but I'm also for
we have a
a nudge to be
homicide rate of
given
5
to
per
America.
100,000.
I'm
Okay.
also for a correction of America. So if
Okay,
Putin
fair.
was to invade America, I'd be rooting too.
Man. JF, if I may ask, what, like, through military,
he's against globo homo. That's what it. JF, can you just say, like, so I've said globo homo like 10,000 fucking times. Are you against the cosmopolitan, internationalist, mixed economy, capitalist, liberal project that is Western hegemony?
Absolutely, I radically oppose to it in every possible way.
Perfect.
JF, do you have like I don't know, a history with Russia at not obviously bloodline because you told us you were French, but through my contacts, like I met many people in the U.S. military who joined from Russia in order to get citizenship here because obviously they did not think kindly of their nation, and I honestly did not hear that many good things about it. So, what are some of the good things about Russia that you can maybe inform us on that make you trust it so much?
One example is illustrated on my TV. Alexander II, who is the Tsar of Russia, who sold, by the way, Alaska to the US. I think it was a bad decision, but anyway. Alexander II has been liberating the slaves in Russia, basically at the same time, a few years after it was done in the US. Around 1861, he liberated the slaves. So Alexander the Liberator, here's one example of some of the great accomplishments that have happened in Russia. This flag, I don't like communism, but you have to recognize that a country that was relatively backwards 100 years ago, or at least not much more developed than many other countries in Europe, ended up being a space exploring, spacefaring country. And to some extent beat all of the other countries at it for a moment, and ended up developing a scientific and academic progress that was comparable to that of the US at some point in history. Those are great realizations of Russia, and it shows that it's a good people in there. There are some qualities in there that I would want to grow and to take their own direction in life, not be influenced precisely by the American regime and the whole international control that it imposes.
So are
Okay,
there
and then
similar Americans that you admire, or is the entire thing ruined because now we're the empire?
Oh, no, I admire the great American scientists and the great thinkers, and I mean, I'm a biologist. I love many people in America who have done work in biology and who have made civilization progress. But the regime, I don't like it. The direction it's taking in terms of fighting against its own population, I don't like it.
what do you, if you don't like it so much, and I'm just thinking this through, I met the Russians in the military who wanted to come here so bad that they were willing to sign up for 0300 infantry. And I was like, man,
They were
you're
attracted to our materialist, hedonist, nihilist, globo homo project where we use titties to get people to sign up for fucking, to buy Camaros at 18% interest. So listen, I love the United States. I think when you're 15 to 25, the United States, like the broader, more secular, hedonistic culture can be really fun. I think as you grow older, it becomes increasingly shallow and hollow. And so I was in the military, I had military friends. I think when you're 18, it's cool to want to see strippers and get drunk and all that kind of crap. I think as you get older, life should be more complicated and more deep than that. So I'm not surprised that young Russian men wanted to see fake titties and drive nice cars.
well, that's not why they come over. If we want to have a deep discussion on why they came over, I talked to them for a long time. But what is stopping you, JF? What's the critical factor stopping you from doing, the opposite of what they did and, going and supporting? I mean, you have credentials that if you showed up in Russia with these credentials, and obviously if you liquidated what you had here and went to Russia, right now the ruble is like nothing. But you came over with your yeah, dude, seriously, if you came
Live
over
like
and
a
exchanged
king.
yeah, you would. I mean, what's that thing stopping you from saying, "Okay, I see the place that I want to mirror into reality for the rest of the world. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna take my skills and I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna use them and I'm gonna support the country to expand." Because yeah, why?
But that's a misrepresentation of my view. I don't root for Russia. I don't
Oh,
want to live in Russia. I don't agree with the Russian regime. All
oh,
I'm telling you is that there's a regime that's oppressing me right now. It's the American regime, and it's oppressing a lot of other people around the world. If we can get this regime to have an equal force to eventually oppose it, it will be in our advantage. By the way, I've already escaped America, so it's not like the US government is oppressing me on an everyday basis. I've already fled because I wanted to gather my own liberty and make a life for myself. So, what I'm looking at right now is a possibility to develop a force that would eventually clash with the US, and I want it to happen. And I want other people who cannot liberate themselves because for me, it's not an individual problem. I can escape the oppression of the American government. I have money, I can take the plane, I can buy houses anywhere in the world. But not everyone can do that, and I'd like to liberate the people who are currently on the territory of America.
gotcha. Okay. And Michael X, $5. Thank you, sir, for your donation. Is in front. Zelensky is in front of his Kiev green screen, begging for foreign fighters. I will buy a CP a one-way ticket to fight for his beliefs. What you say?
I got 8 years in security services. My back and neck are already fucked up. I already raised $4,000 for Ukrainian armed forces myself. And So fuck you, number one. And then number two, basically, I do. If you want to give that to somebody else who wants to go fight for him, then fuck yeah, do it, King. I support you. Thank you for supporting the brave Ukrainian people in their resistance of an autocratic regime. That's really cool of you to do.
Okay, Looter, I hope you're out there. I did not miss your question. For JF Gary Epi, why do you believe that Russia's interests supersede Ukraine's? If Ukraine wishes to align, you want to go that part one first, and then I'll go to the next one. Yeah.
No, finish it.
Oh, if Ukraine wishes to align with NATO/EU as a sovereign nation, they ought to have that freedom to do so.
There is no freedom that exists out there other than the freedom you can defend for yourself. If someone has a bigger club than you and they're bashing on your cranium and you die, you have zero freedom. So the reality of the world is that power ultimately determines any amount of freedom you have. Freedom is a concept that exists within nation, and it's about how people respect the freedom of others. I commit not to commit an act of aggression against Pedro, and Pedro commits not to commit an act of aggression against me if we live in the same country. But within countries, there is no such thing. Within countries, whoever has the power can impose its will on others. America has been doing it for almost 100 years now, and now Russia is doing it for the last few weeks, and people are losing their shit.
Are you fucking kidding me? Like, the entire history of the 20th century? Are you fucking kidding me? Like, god damn it. All right, so never mind. That was just like a super ahistorical fucking statement.
What's ahistorical? The idea that America has been imposing its will onto the world for the last 100 years?
They just made a fucking statement about political realism. Do I have to break down every fucking country's geopolitical fucking influence on each other over the past century? Like, I already know you know this. Like that's what's frustrating to me about what the fuck you're saying. Like, you already know for a goddamn fact that if the United States wasn't asserting its influence in these locations, then basically a power vacuum would exist, and then other states would do the same fucking thing. So, and then on top of that, you also know that within these regions, there's been other players who have made the same fucking play. So to like pretend, like, okay, so on one hand, if you're saying that America is the global hegemon, so it's been doing it disproportionately, yeah, sure. But just I don't know, the way you fucking said that triggered the fuck out of me.
All you just said for Russia.
Okay. So this brings up an important question.
Russia is filling the power void in Ukraine. Oh.
Okay. No. This brings up an important question. So let's say, however improbable you think that it is, let's say the Ukrainians are able to muster enough foreign aid and foreign weapons into their inventories that they are successfully able to fight off the Russian invasion. Are you going to support their fucking Darwinian fucking right to survive that they fucking kicked the fucking Russians' teeth in, and now they've asserted themselves within their geopolitical fucking realm?
Darwin cares not about what is said. Darwin is about what happens. And those people who are dead cannot complain that their freedoms were abolished. No one is there to complain. The only reality that exists is the reality in front of our eyes, the actual physical world as it deploys. And as people get their craniums bashed by clubs, they don't exist anymore to complain that Darwinian considerations were or were not taken into account. It's all a race for existence and survival, and ultimately the only person who have a say on it at any point in time is those who have eliminated the threats around them.
Okay, so let's say the Ukrainians do that. Will you support them as the victors of the conflict? Will you be like, well, fuck it. I guess they earned that win. Good job, fellas.
I will not, because I don't support the state of the world with a corrupt Ukrainian regime that leads to lots of human suffering, lots of human trafficking, and lots of neo-Nazism, to be honest.
Okay, yeah. So if I were to start Googling your complaints about Ukraine, and if I was to start researching human trafficking in Russia, neo-Nazism in Russia, corruption in Russia, do you think that I would find like similar variables associated with that country? Or do you think that, basically they would be completely different? So your assessment wouldn't equally apply to Russia?
Well, we haven't talked in this debate about my view of Russia. There are lots
Mhm.
of things to be corrected about Russia. I don't
So
like the
you only care
corruption
about them
there.
insofar as they're a counter hegemon.
Exactly, they are a good golem to have in this fight.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I do actually owe you an apology, JF. I was making a question earlier that said you were pro Russia and you want like sound I made it sound like you want to be Russian. But listening more closely and looking back into my notes I have here, it's not that. It is purely what you just what counterpoints and you just established. Um I think it's if I had to try and bridge you two, because I hate to have people on this show who just hate each other, you know. I don't think you
I
guys hate
don't
each
I
other. I
don't
think
hate JF. I don't know how
yeah,
he feels about me,
perfect.
but I respect his fucking intellect. I just hate his fucking perspectives. I think he's a smart
Beautiful.
motherfucker. And also the pain in the fucking ass about this is I'm like, "Oh, I got a sweet fucking dunk. What if Mexicans wanted to break away from America?" And he's like, "Nope, that's fine." I was like, "Well, fuck me. I abhor his positions, but at least he's consistent." So
Okay.
I completely disagree with his perspectives. I think they can be used to do like really evil shit across the world, but I respect the intelligence and I respect the consistency of arguments. And I'm sure the way that I feel that his perspectives are evil is the way that he feels that my perspectives are evil, because I apologize for global homo and international liberalism and the integration of the mixed economy capitalist order. So I'm sure the feeling is mutual. So yeah.
Awesome. See that? That's awesome. Earlier when you guys called each other the C words, I was like, oh man, this sucks. They
What
could
the
have
fuck
been
did I call
friends.
him? Did I call him a Croat? What the fuck did I
No,
call
it's the,
him?
no.
No, it's
I don't want to say
because you
it's the
no,
cuckman.
you use the word of insult
Oh,
for
Yeah,
oh,
females.
yeah,
okay, got you. All right,
yeah.
sorry, my bad.
No worries, no worries, no worries. We're all friends now. Go away for $5. We appreciate you. Why does NATO have to expand to Ukraine? What does that do for U.S. citizens? Why do they want to do this? Help me understand.
It's the same thing that I already said. It's a $65 trillion internationalist mixed economy capitalist project. The more countries that get integrated into it, the more powerful liberalism and mixed economy capitalism is. There's really only like 3 or 4 major countries that resist this world order. It's Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, and Venezuela. The reason why you hear about them on the news all the time is because these are the people who do not play ball with the global hegemony. Basically, as many people who can be brought into the European and American hegemon is one less piece, like chess piece, on the table that can be played by our rivals. So it's an international game. It's economic and diplomatic and military, and it affects your daily life. If you literally type that shit in on a fucking smartphone, then chances are that that smartphone was manufactured with plastics from the Middle East, smart materials from either Central America or Central Asia, and was basically manufactured in China or some other Southeast Asian country in order to be provided for you. You are consuming the products of this materialist empire every day without knowing it.
JF, did you want to interact with that at all?
Uh, Consumerist crap. I hope that the world takes a different direction. I hope that people eventually get deprived of this material and refocus on themselves and their family.
Okay. JF, can I ask you something that I heard a person named Tulsi Gabbard give this take? Is it possible to have turned Ukraine into like just a neutral like Switzerland? We have a Switzerland 2.0. Here we go. Like can we was that ever a possibility or am I just being heads in the clouds on that one?
It's a theoretical possibility. There's one obstacle to it: the Ukrainian people, which for more than 200 years now has been masters at leveraging their position as an kind of in the middle country between the East and the West. And the problem with these middle nations is that they keep switching position, they keep oscillating between the two sides because they want to gain everything that they can gain from both sides. The way Ukraine wants to gain access to the global market that Counterpoints is presenting, but they also want to gain the low gas price of Russia. And so, at different points of its history, it shows allegiance to the two sides. Because of this kind of oscillating mind of betrayal and lack of loyalty, basically Ukraine cannot help itself but to betray. It's in their nature, it's in their way of life, and it's their actual political strategy. For that, there can be no stability obtained from their own free choice, because their own free choice leads them to vacate their own position in a cycle of about 5 to 10 years.
And
Okay.
I am such a fucking liberal, because for me it's like, why the fuck can't you have cheap Russian oil and fucking Funko Pops from Japan and fucking all this shit? And by the way, like, we were talking about like spiritual malaise and consumerism. I agree with JF that this shit is super shallow. But at the same time, it's the way that our world operates, and a lot of people find value in whatever consumer products that they consume, and in the expression of themselves through material acquisition and gain and customization. So so basically, just to dismiss it, I think is a little shallow. But I do agree with him that like we need to refocus the human experiment to value localism and family and community and all that kind of shit. But I don't think you have to destroy the United States or the global order in order to do that. I think you just need to create that culture.
Well, here's the bridge. I think this is the bridge between you, because it's not about economics, really. It's not about land grabbing. It's not about, who owns what. I think you both are identifying it's about worldview here that you want to promote. You want to change the nature, the conduct of peoples of nation, correct? That's at base form, like ground level, right, JF? That's what you want to do? And
Yes.
counterpoints, right?
I agree with this, but then your worldview dictates your action. So kind of like JF was saying, like ultimately words are wind, and it's really action and impact that have a real impact on our material world. I agree with that as well. But I think the starting point is words. So people believing in an idea to implement into the world is the first step.
Right, because it seems like you both just said that it was either a possibility, and yes, definitely, I would want to walk into that diplomatic room, right, and make it Switzerland 2.0. You don't know how, theoretically, it's possible, and it's going to take a lot of arguing, but you would have struggled in that room to get there rather than this outcome. Is that fair to say
I
for both of you?
I would have, for just for the sake of preserving human life, and also from like utilitarian everybody loses everybody wins kind of basis, yes, I would have tried to have done that.
And there's a third person who agrees with both of us, Vladimir Putin. But
Oh, shut
unfortunately,
the
we
fuck
cannot
up.
convince Zelensky. I mean, he
Well,
did.
well, well, Putin's not
He's
here
such an
right now, but I
excellent
gotta say,
statesman.
well, Putin's not
It-
here right now, but I gotta say that's why I'm the best moderator out there, because I just got these guys to both agree with each other, and just a minute ago they were calling each other cucks. Let's go.
uh,
Let's do this. I can do this.
what a
How?
fucking centrist you are, Pedro. What a fucking enlightened
Well, I'm not a
centrist.
centrist. I'm not a centrist, but go away. Making it rain tonight with another $5. How far is U.S. going to go? To absorb every nation in this worldview. Why am I not wearing my freaking glasses?
Until there's
Yeah,
nobody left.
yeah.
So I think JF is right. Either the empire. Well, actually, I think we could both be right. Empires, by their nature, tend to collapse. So I think that there's a strong chance that the American empire could collapse. It's just a possibility of logistics. That being said, the international mixed economy capitalist liberal hegemonic project, it never ends. We want everybody in it. We want China in it. We want Iran in it. We want any of our rivals. We want in it, because ultimately, like, cultural and economic integration would reduce the likelihood of war. It creates an opportunity for competition, and it unfortunately, I know for global homo or whatever, but like it does give people passive communication that likely reduce conflict. So
Gotcha. And this will be our last question, because I cannot afford JF more gratitude than right now for coming on to the show, and you as well, Counterpoints. Thank you so much for coming on for almost 2 hours and 30 minutes. We usually we try and keep it to 2 hours or 2 hours and 15, but you guys went the mile, and I very much appreciate that. And Jonathan Dow has been killing it with the super chats tonight. To JF, how does TRP inform the situation? Thank you for your $2, sir.
The revolutionary phenotype, my theory that if we modify our genes, we are committed to enslaving ourselves by the entity that will modify us, which will probably be a computer or an AI. I guess that the way to see it in this conflict is that America and its extension are a danger to the existence of the human race. And the more they play with genetic modification, the more they fund labs in China that do it, the more they teach Chinese scientists to do it, the more we are at risk of triggering an irreversible destruction of human civilization. And so you should root for the side that will de-technologize the world, demodify and de-engage from genetic research, genetic modification research, and that would be if Russia can triumph over the US.
Awesome. Hey, Counterpoints, do you want to shout yourself out? And Justin614, you are correct, sir. You are totally correct. Shout yourself out for your channel, sir. Let us know where we can find you.
Yeah, so my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. I'm a science fiction, political philosophy nerd, and a like Warhammer enthusiast. That's one of my consumerist habits is tiny plastic men. But I do enjoy it, and it's a good time. And so if you're into science fiction, politics, philosophy, or violence, then I probably have something for you. Go to YouTube, type in Counterpoints, common spelling, Counterpoints, Counterpoints. I am live on Twitch. I'm live on YouTube. I will be on Odyssey. And yeah, come check us out.
Thank you, sir, for coming to the show. And JF, I'm not saying you're worth $2 by no means, but obviously Ryan B is helping us out. Thank you for your $2 donation, sir. JF, did you watch AFPAC 3? Thoughts? And then also you can plug yourself too at the end of that, sir.
No, I didn't watch. And if you want to see my show, it's JFG Tonight on Odyssey every night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
All right. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Crucible, where we host not right platform debates. This is the battleground where everybody comes to, that anyone is available to come into for the truth. No, it's not right or left. It is just the truth that's being fought for here. Thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.